Thanks. I'm asked to speak about oil and gas, and that's a big topic, a really big topic. So I decided to break it down into 5 areas of policy or law that, in the theme of Alberta resistance, that we could all engage with our MLAs about, or issues that people might want to consider for recall of an MLA. And those 5 areas are: first, royalties. I think we really need to talk about that. We've got to fund hospitals, roads. We are rich, extremely rich, one of the richest places in the world in oil and gas. We're giving it away. We can stop and we can fund every last thing easily, with ease, that have been discussed today. Second, contrary to what governments and industry would have us to believe, the oil and gas industry in Alberta is neither ethical nor is it responsible. Third, Alberta citizens, that's us people. We do not have an abandoned oil and gas or orphan well problem in this province. Industry has a big orphan well problem. It's industry's problem. It's not ours. Let's not let them make it our problem, okay? Fourth, Alberta laws are based on the polluter pay principle, but they're either ignored, including by regulators and administrative tribunals, or they're under extreme attack from industry and politicians that are sympathetic to industry. I'm just going to take this out. It's easier. So I'm going to discuss that briefly. And fifth, there are massive economic benefits to clean up in oil and gas. We have wells that need to be cleaned up in almost every corner of this province. If we enforce our laws, if we enforce the polluter pay principle, it's huge business opportunities. It's huge job opportunities in almost every corner of the province. So those are the 5 main things I'm going to cover, and I'm going to breeze through them as fast as possible, try to get back on schedule if we can. And Jenny already covered some of this, so I'm going to build on it, and I'm going to cut out a few things I originally meant to speak about. So first, we, the public in Alberta, own this incredible wealth, but we're mismanaging these resources, and we've pretty much always mismanaged them. We had a premier named Lougheed who tried hard to manage the resources for a while. He did pretty good. Do you know that we collected more royalties in his day, producing about roughly a fifth of what we produce today? That's appalling. It's the biggest rip-off in world history. We're giving our minerals away to oil companies. For what? So I'm going to talk about 3 things, 3 buzzwords you can think about to talk to your MLAs about. And the first one is something called C-Star. C-Star is we give free oil and gas to oil companies until they recover their drilling costs of a well, their completion costs of a well, and their fracking costs of a well. We don't have to, we just do. Why do we do that? This contributes to a lot of uneconomic holes in the ground. Jenny talked about these liabilities. Their total, conventional oil and gas liabilities are $130 million, largely made up of wells that should have never been drilled in the first place because they're uneconomical. The second one, we give the same sort of royalty holidays to oil sands mining companies. We pay for their plants, their equipment, their trucks, their massive earth-moving machines, every desk and every pencil. They don't pay for any of it. We give them free oil for all that stuff. We don't have to, but we do. And now, there's a proposal being proposed now. It's called R-Star. I won't get into it too much. Nate Pike, who was sitting here, invited me onto his podcast. It's episode, I wrote it down, 4.56, The Breakdown Alberta. If you want to learn more about R-Star, look it up. We discussed it in detail on that podcast. But it's simple. It's simple. The Premier Smith's pet proposal is to give away more oil and gas so that they recover the cost of their cleanup. And we certainly don't have to do this one because they're already obliged to clean up by law. So if we stop these royalty holidays, if we stop charging the lowest royalties in the world by far, because we're one of the biggest oil producers, we can fund everything that you guys talked about here today. We can have all the doctors we want and all the nurses and all the paramedics and the best roads, etc. We don't have to give our resources away to an industry. That's moves me on to the second topic, that this industry is neither responsible nor ethical, despite what you hear our politicians like Brian Jean say. And I'm not going to get into this in too much detail, but just a few examples. The responsibles, they comply with the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. They would operate in compliant with our great public safety regulations in Alberta instead of operating illegally all the time. The responsible honor their contractual commitments with landowners, and they pay municipal taxes. That's what responsible and ethical companies do, but that's not what the oil companies in our province are doing anymore, because they know they can get away with it. And I've been doing this for a long time, but the mischief out there is getting a lot worse in the last couple of years. They know that nobody's going to hold them accountable, so it's just getting worse. Responsible oil companies do not infiltrate their regulator. We have this thing called the Alberta Energy Regulator, and I've had to break this talk down into 3 words. What's wrong in Alberta? I'd have to say the Alberta Energy Regulator. We must reform this outfit. It's captured, it's corrupt, and I spoke with a little Mickey Mouse oil field company on land in urban Edmonton. And by the way, this is not a rural problem. We have oil and gas, and illegal oil and gas, and unsafe oil and gas in almost every town and city in this province. Calgary, not too much, but it's everywhere. And it's an urban problem too. My family had urban lands. We couldn't develop those lands for years and years and years because of vast amounts of sweet gas being vented. It's amazing the town of Didsbury didn't explode. It's absolutely amazing. And this is happening everywhere. It's happening everywhere. Not long ago, I spoke with an executive, a little outfit. It's called MEGA, Make Alberta Great Again in Edmonton. They're broke. They don't pay the landowners. Don't pay their taxes. Can't afford a compressor for their facility that's next to Anthony Henday Drive, which vents sour gas across the freeway. And Mr. David Yeager, who's Smith's right-hand man on oil and gas, he knows all about it. So does the chief of staff of the Alberta Energy, because I go on Twitter about it and stuff. Oh yeah, they call me up. They want to go, how do I get there? David Yeager says, how do I get to this location? But they don't do anything. They just want to shut me up. Well, I'm not shutting up. People's lives are at danger. I get calls every week from dozens of landowners who have gas venting going on in their backyards, especially in the Lloydminster area. It's really bad. Most of these wells in the Lloydminster area, they just let the gas go to atmosphere. It's illegal in Alberta. It's been illegal since 1972, but we let them do it. The feds just want to cap emissions. Believe me, industry knows how bad. I was in that industry 50 years. They know how bad their emissions are. But this guy, Mega, says, oh, everybody in Calgary, I quote, everybody in Calgary knows the Alberta Energy Regulator is a disaster. Well, I think if industry knows it, the rest of us ought to know it. And we ought to do something about it. So that, so much for responsible and ethical oil and gas. I'm not going to spend too much time on this one, but this is one that is really, really important. I can't stress how important this is. And I've been on a talk show after talk show on this topic. It's called Orphans, and people just still don't get it. But we as citizens don't have an abandoned or orphan well problem. First of all, we have to talk about what an abandoned well is. It's one that's decommissioned or plugged in accordance with AER Directive 20. It's not one that oil companies walked away from. So the media hears, oh, well, we've got 230-some thousand abandoned wells in Alberta. That means they've been put to bed in a manner that's deemed to be safe by our regulator. I got news for you, it's not so safe. I got news for you. All these wells is nothing but cement and steel that will corrode away. They will all leak. We have yet to figure out how to properly plug wells, and we've got 470,000 of them in this province. And they're in our roads, in our fields, in our schoolyards, in our playgrounds. They're everywhere. I live in North Edmonton, Adriana LaGrange. I can't get to my house without driving over at least 12 abandoned wells in Northwest Red Deer. They're everywhere. So I'm going to give just a little bit of history about this. In the 80s and the 90s, regulators and politicians figured out that, hey, oil companies actually could go bankrupt. In those days, no one ever thought of that. And they discovered that big oil companies were what we call liability dumping. They were transferring their so-called assets, which are wells that need to be retired or no longer economically viable, off to smaller and smaller companies. And the government and the regulator wanted to require security deposits like they do in some other jurisdictions. And industry in Alberta said, no, don't do this to us. If you make us pay security deposits, if you restrict who we can transfer our wells to, it'll hurt investment. Let us do whatever we want. And in return, if any of our members fail, any of oil companies in Alberta go bankrupt, we will, as an industry, look after the cost of retiring those wells and cleaning up that land. And so what we got is a legislation. It's Part 11 of the Oil and Gas Conservation Act, and it's called the Orphan Fund. And it's the envy of the world. Americans don't have anything like this. When wells get orphaned, or when people walk away from them, what we improperly call abandoning them in Alberta, in America, the public does have to pay, because they weren't like our wise legislators. They didn't look into the future, and they have to pay, but we don't. But there's a problem. There's a big problem. There's two problems, really. And the first problem is that we've got this regulator that's supposed to levy an amount on industry to capitalize that orphan fund once per year that would cover the cost of retiring all the wells that were named orphans in that same similar period of time, like 1 year. And the levy, as Jenny said, has been 75 million. It got up last year to 135 million, but we got about 34,000 licenses in Alberta held by about 300 companies, 298 companies. And according to the Alberta Energy Regulator, those 300 companies have about $25 between them. And their wells and facilities aren't named as orphans yet, but they need to be. That's 34,000 of them. We've only named about 10,000 wells orphans so far in Alberta. We've cleaned up we've plugged about 3/4 of them, but the other, approximately half of those wells that have been orphans for years and years and years and years and years are not, those sites aren't cleaned up yet. They're not certified as reclaimed. And here's where the citizens are paying. So people erroneously in Alberta think that the public's paying for these costs. So far to date, we really haven't, other than the $1 billion that the feds put up, which I begged them not to put up. So far, citizens haven't paid for much, but they're about to. And so that's what I want to point out. But there's one exception to this. So when land is taken in Alberta for oil and gas and other purposes, it's called specified land. It has to be certified as reclaimed. And once it's certified as reclaimed, the use of that land reverts back to the landowner. So we're not cleaning this land up. So because oil and gas can force their way on to land in Alberta, we as landowners don't really have a choice. Because of that, landowners who aren't being paid, and bankrupt oil companies don't pay the landowners for their losses, compensate them for their losses. So landowners who don't get paid are entitled to recover that amount through Section 36 of the Service Rights Act from you, the taxpayer. So the result of delaying cleanup of orphan wells is that you're paying the landowner. So now they plug the wells first, but that doesn't stop municipal taxes and it doesn't stop landowner payments. So these amounts are growing bigger and bigger and bigger. And for the most, this is the one exception where taxpayers are actually paying. And if we were to make a law change and have this payments to landowners come out of the Orphan Fund, where industry is supposed to pay, and if we were to reform this regulator to properly lever the amounts on industry, and let's be clear, this is what they asked for. This is entrenched in law. This is not being mean to them. They got what they asked for. This is a fair deal. That's it. So big companies like CNRL and Encana, the more wells you have, the more you're levied for the Orphan Fund. So these big companies that suggested this in the first place, now it's time to pay the piper. Now they have to pick up the costs of retiring these orphan wells, and they don't want to. So they're lobbying government, and we've got a pretty sympathetic ear with this current government. So, to sum up, this orphan fund that we have, if properly managed, until the last oil company falls, you shouldn't have to pick up the tab for any cleanup. That's how it's supposed to work. There's lots of them still out there, and they got big bucks, especially the ones in the oil sand. They're making unbelievable record profits. Unbelievable. Let's make them clean up. Let's get, I'll come to how much, So the fourth topic I want to talk about is Alberta laws are based on the polluter pay principle. And this principle is either being ignored by regulators and administrative tribunals. I'm talking the former Surface Rights Board. It's now called the Land and Property Rights Tribunal. It decides compensation disputes between operators and landowners. Either these laws are ignored or they're under extreme attack from industry and politicians that are sympathetic to industry. This will and is impacting land values. If you want to get rural people to make this government smarten up, communicate to them how their land values are going to go through the tubes. The Auditor General last year reported how bogus these reclamation certificates. The government is guaranteeing on your behalf that these sites have been cleaned up to government standards when they haven't been cleaned up. Happened on my own land. You're guaranteeing this. And if you guarantee it, that means you're responsible in the future when these problems arise. So they're not cleaning up, and the banks, guess what? They know it. They're the ones that finance these oil and gas companies in the first place. They know how bogus these reclamation certificates are. You can't borrow money for land unless it's from the Farm Credit Corporation or something anymore in Alberta, and that trend's now, I represent mostly urban landowners. We've known this for decades, but it's now happening to rural landowners. So land values are going to be a huge problem unless we smarten up and let's make the polluter pay. Polluter pay laws, as I said, include the requirement for industry to compensate host landowners. We do not rent land in oil and gas to oil and gas in Alberta, and we never have, but they call it rent. Landowners aren't allowed to profit from oil and gas on their land. They're entitled to only recover the losses they can prove they're entitled to. It's hard to prove your losses, I assure you. Okay? So if we fail to require these companies to compensate landowners for their actual losses, crop losses and other losses that they could have earned from that same portion of their land that's occupied by oil and gas, well, then we're forcing landowners to subsidize this industry. And if you want to bring about change fast in Alberta, take away landowner compensation. Believe me, I deal with these people. The only thing that keeps landowners happy is they're being compensated. And if the oil company stops compensating them or only pays half, which lots of them are doing now, they're breaking their contracts. I'm only going to give you half. And you, as the taxpayers, picking up the rest. So the landowners are still happy, but you're the ones paying. This is not a rural problem. Most people that are picking up this tab are urban folk. The government's conducting what's called mature asset strategy sessions right now. I was not invited. I asked David Yeager, who was phoning me all the time, trying to shut me up, if he would invite me. And he said, oh, no, 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 can't do that. Mature asset strategy sessions, what's happening is that the brokest shallow natural gas producers in this province who cannot continue to operate if they have to pay landowners and if they have to pay municipal taxes, they have the ear of government. And the push is on to reduce or eliminate landowner payments and to reduce or eliminate municipal taxes. And if you want to have a rural electorate turn on a government, get that message out to rural people. I'll tell you, I deal with them all the time. This is a key thing for anybody who wants to get this government to start acting more responsible, is to realize that rural people, once they really know what's going on, will speak out that they're not going to stand for this. The fifth one, I won't spend too much time on this because it's pretty basic. Oil and gas cleanup is big business. The potential for related job creation in virtually every corner of the province is massive. It's unlimited. Enforcement of the polluter pay principle in this province is good for the economy. And it's the law of the land. Why not enforce the law? We enforce presumably theft laws and murder laws and speeding laws and everything. Why not enforce the laws of the land? So I'm going to tell you that every problem we talked about in oil and gas in this room today, plus thousands of others, I assure you that probably no later than 1971 or 1972, possibly as early as 1947, some wise legislators of the past, who probably aren't even alive anymore, already put a remedy on the books that is there in law right now, but there's nobody to enforce those remedies. And that primarily means the Alberta Energy Regulator. The other problem we have is that there's more than one body, and nobody knows what the overlapping jurisdiction is. There's a huge fender. Everybody at this table, point left, please. Everybody point left. Whose problem is it? If you're at a circular table and everybody, that's what happens in Alberta. So it's the same cementing trucks that'll plug those wells that pump the cement behind the pipe when it was drilled. It takes the same excavating equipment to get rid of a road, get rid of a site, than it did to build it in the first place. Probably more, because there's probably contamination on a lot of these sites now. When the people are out there working all across the province getting rid of these sites, and at the pace we're going, it's 100 years. But if we pick up the pace by 10 times or 6 times, guess what? We got full employment. Good jobs in this province, business opportunities galore, people out in the field, hotels are busy, restaurants are busy. Let's let these urban business people in these small towns realize how quick a return to prosperity could be if we just enforce the laws on the books. We're going to have some time for questions, I hope. I'm going to go over, Jenny had a slide up here on the numbers of wells drilled in different categories. I'm going to go over this real briefly, but so we've drilled roughly in Alberta 470,000 holes in the ground that are oil, gas, and disposal wells. Half of them are abandoned. Abandoned means decommissioned, plugged with cement, and cut off below surface where we don't know where they're hiding anymore. That's why they're in our streets and in our school playgrounds and in our fields, waiting to leak and blow somebody to kingdom come. About 28% of those total wells that have an abandoned status, that are plugged, are supposed to be safely put to bed. The land has not been cleaned up yet. So let's be clear that most of these abandoned wells were dry holes in the first place. They were drilled. They didn't find oil or gas in commercial quantities. So they plug the well, but they still leave the site. They still pay the landowner, or the landowner is still being paid by you guys. Okay? So, but the most important figure here is that we have 12% of these wells that are drilled that are today producing and are economically viable. 12% only. Those are the wells that must pay for all that cleanup work. And if we, so what's been happening in Alberta is they've kicked this can down the road. An industry, that's their plan. If we kick this thing down the road far enough, guess what? We'll all just go broke one day and we'll leave this in the citizens' lap. That's their plan. And we have to change that plan. We've got to make them, we've got to grab some of this income from this 12% of these wells that are still producing to make sure that they all get to bed properly. And remember, a lot of these wells will have to re-enter over and over and over for all time to come, because you know, I talked about it not being rent. Oil companies don't lease land from landowners, especially for a well, because you can't evict a well. Even when they don't pay you, even when you get them off their land, that thing's there. That hole in the ground, that liability, that, you know, path to groundwater, that path to air is there for all time. And we need to think about that, especially when we go to our MLAs and say, get rid of C-Star. Don't pay these companies to drill uneconomic wells anymore, because you as a government are addicted to the pittance royalties that we charge in Alberta. Let's turn this around. So anyway, in summary, we can and we should increase royalties. Somebody said the 4th biggest oil producer in the world and the 5th largest natural gas producer in the world. Why should we charge the lowest royalties in the world? Are our American landowners so strong that we can't manage our own oil and gas? That's the question we have to ask. And, you know, we must require these oil companies to properly compensate landowners so that they're made whole for the takings. The land rights are taken from these landowners. They don't have a choice. And in terms of the changes that the current government wants to make to our relatively good oil and gas laws, we've got to ask them to strengthen polluter pay, not weaken polluter pay. If we don't, the result will be decreased land values, decreased public safety, and the bill for all this is going to end up in your kid's lap. But I just want to end on that, because the bill for every man, woman, and child in Alberta for conventional gas only is $28,000 each. So if UCP voters or other people want to write their check, let's let them. Let's let them. And that's another $28,000 for oil sands and tailing ponds. So it's $56,000 per person. That's a lot of money for a lot of families in Alberta. Your choice is clear. We can, at law, make the polluter pay and should return to economic prosperity in this province, or you can all pay. Take your pick.